Now you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. We're back after a brief hiatus last week. There was some things going on in everybody's lives that we just weren't able to make the podcast happen, but we're back and we've got plenty to get stuck into. So without further ado, I'm going to get stuck into that with the usual guests. That is Juco James and Alan Morrison. Guys, how are you doing?
All right.
Good to be back, hanging in there.
Yeah, look. Yeah. We were supposed to start at 5, but we thought since we made everyone wait an extra week for the podcast, we'd just make them wait a tiny bit more, maybe 6 minutes past 5. So we're doing quite well in terms of our punctuation this week.
You had a chance. You had a chance to throw me under the bus again, Enda, and you didn't do it. I'm a bit surprised.
What did I do this time?
Well, you could have been honest and said it's my fault that we're late.
No, I
you
wouldn't
didn't take
do
that chance. Yeah.
I wouldn't do that. Are you good enough for this podcast? That's the main question, Alan. Are you good enough?
Well, it's a matter of opinion now. So let the data speak for itself.
Look, we've got plenty to get stuck into. We've had 3 games since we last recorded a podcast, 2 games since we last recorded a podcast. I'm not really sure, but the main one that we're going to be focusing on this evening is the 5-1 win against St Mirren. I guess the first observation for this game is that 5-1 is probably a flattering scoreline for Celtic in the end. It definitely didn't seem like a 5-1 game to me. A lot of the goals coming in the second half, loads of them coming from our substitutes, O'Reilly and Hatate getting 2 of them. O getting his first goal, Maeda getting a goal. And I guess we'll touch on St Mirren because they did play a very interesting style of football, and St Mirren have been the team that everybody have been sort of following in terms of the way they were setting up against Celtic, and they changed their style ever so slightly in this game. So we'll touch on that later on in the podcast. But I guess early thoughts on this performance and this win, James.
Yeah, I think it was a tale of the first 70 minutes, and then when the penalty occurred and the man was sent off, then it was floodgates open, which you would expect. I mean, the pattern, as we've talked about over and over again, is the inability for most domestic teams to be able to hang in for more than an hour, maybe 70 minutes, and as Alan has documented and smartly talked about regularly, is how much the extra subs benefit us. So you combine that with them losing a man, and it's a recipe for some serious damage to get done. And we've been on a good kind of run of form relative to finishing as well. So we've been kind of overperforming a little bit since the World Cup. So when you combine all those factors, I think it was a good last half hour, let's say, and but it was a bit of a struggle before that, I think, and this goes back to the broader conversation about some of the trends that have emerged in the copycat area of people all kind of within a range, and I'm sure Alan will talk about some of the tweaks that they've made, but generally speaking, a lot of the opposition are falling into the same neighborhood, shall we say, as far as how they're going about addressing us. And I can see why, because there are some signs of at least improved periods at points. And again, I think for the first hour in particular, St Mirren did put that on display again.
Yeah, Celtic have had to adjust a couple of times this season because of injuries. They have to do that again in this game with Maeda moving into the centre for a short period when Kyogo went off injured, and I thought Maeda was playing quite well up until that point and continued that fine form on again when he went into the middle. But my only thoughts I will give on VAR in this podcast is that it took over 4 minutes to award a penalty in which there were 2 clear and obvious handballs. And it's just like, how in under God's name does it take that long? And I've gone through the period of mourning for football through VAR with English football over the last 2 years. And it was taking ages to get to these decisions. And they finally sped it up. But to go through that again in the second time now at Scotland, it's just an incredibly frustrating experience as a fan. And Alan, I know you've spoken about VAR a couple of times. This momentum that is wasted with this amount of time coming to these decisions doesn't favour Celtic in any way, shape or form. I know, look, the outcome of this was a penalty and a red card, so you can't really complain all that much. but it's more the goals. I know every goal is checked by VAR, but it seems to take longer to check Celtics than to check any other goal. So it's just the delays in the games aren't ideal in any way for Celtic.
So if you've noticed that, and it must be remarkable that the fact. And listen, I don't watch. I mean, watch the highlights of some of the other SPFL games, but unless you watch the game live, you cannot tell what the gap is between when the goal's scored and when the final restart is given by the referee, i.e. all the VAR checks are over. And what I do know is in a tiny sample that, with every Celtic goal, and we're talking going about the last sort of three matches, so that's quite a lot of goals actually, about 9 or 11 or 12 goals, what have you. There is on average, well over a minute of scrutiny of every goal Celtic have scored before a restart. And with each of the, I think there's only been 2 opposition goals, and both of them, one was 30 seconds, and one penalty. It only took a minute for that penalty. Now, I don't know, I welcome if somebody wants to take on a bit of analysis to see if in other games that's the case. I know, for example, because a Hearts fan told me who was there said that when they played at home to the Rangers, that the 3 goals, each of the whistle was ready to go. Basically, the VAR check was over by the time the players lined up to restart the game. Once this, so celebrations were done, everybody lined up, bang, we're off. Whereas with Celtic, it's taking, you line up, you have the celebration, you line up, and then you wait. And this is for every single goal Celtic score. So you've noticed it. I think it's remarkable. It's something. If, as I say, I'd like if somebody wants to, tell me what's happening at other grounds, that would be fantastic, because we probably need a proper sample. But so that's that. It does feel a little bit like we're having our noses rubbed in it a little bit. So that's but it's no surprise. This isn't a mystery. We know that we understand organizational cultures, etc., as we've talked about many times. So there's no point in trying to sort of invent conspiracies or other Machiavellian motives. It's very simple. It's a cultural issue, and that's what it is. But in terms of the game itself, interesting sort of thoughts that occurred to me as James was speaking there, and I think your opening gambit there, Enda, about was it a bit of a struggle? Was it really about the last 70 minutes? Should we be concerned? I was just thinking in my head really, and this is more of a question than a statement really. Is does it matter when you rack up your XG? Does it matter if you're dominant after 70 minutes or 65 minutes, and the first 70 are kind of quite level? And because with Celtic again, you can see it's a trend. It's a trend that your games can be reasonably tight. And this was a St Mirren team that came with, I thought, quite a novel defensive setup in terms of I don't recall the last team that pressed Celtic quite as aggressively and quite as high. I thought the ploy that they had for their Taylor, Richard Taylor maybe, to essentially man mark Moy by coming out of the back 3 to man mark him I thought was interesting. And I think that did rattle Moy a little bit. He was doing well to get a foothold in the game. I thought Gogic did a superb job to smother Callum McGregor. In fact, almost completely nullified him at the game. In fact, he had a negative packing score at one point. That's how bad it was for him. He was being forced. Turnovers were being forced by Gogic. But the problem that St Mirren had, of course, was that they actually forced quite a lot of turnovers from Celtic, and they actually restricted some of the better players getting on the ball. But of course, once they got the ball, they were just awful with it. They just couldn't do anything with it. But and this is where James will rightly conclude that if the same happens in Europe, we will probably get punished a lot more severely. But it's one to ponder: is does it really matter? Does it really matter that because I had it around about 4.5 XG by the end of the game? Does it matter that most of that was racked up after 70 minutes? I'm not sure. I think because, as I say, when you look at the trends, it's pretty consistent. That we get there at the end. I mean, Celtic have got we should celebrate passing the 100 goal mark for the season. 102 goals now, off of an XG which I've got is 99.28. So I think we're doing pretty well. I think that's pretty sort of par for the course, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing about the analysis of Celtic, and it's so hard at times to analyze games that Celtic win 6-0 and score 3 goals in the final 75 minutes, because you have to look at what happened before that. But at the end of the day, they still won 5-1, and it was still a comfortable victory, and they were never really close to having that victory snapped away from them at any point in this game. They were still always in control. And, you know, whether it finished 2-1 or 5-1, Celtic were still the dominant team in this game, and that's sort of the difficulty of analysing their games against opponents like St Mirren. It's different when it comes to the Champions League games when it's much closer. But against opponents like St Mirren and the lower level teams, it does become harder to analyse it because it becomes nitpicking. I mean, how can you look at a 5-1 game that Celtic have won? You know,
that's what we're here for.
12 on the trot, unbeaten now since the World Cup, and then turn around and be like, this is what went wrong against St Mirren. It's really difficult to do that. But we're going to look at the overall structure of the game and the way that St Mirren played against us, because there were some interesting comments from Giakoumakis since we last spoke on this podcast, and that was in a press conference at Atalanta that he's joined in America. Atlanta, not Atalanta, in the Serie A. So he said that at Celtic they play a completely different style to the competition in the SPFL. He said the competition is not very good, the two clubs, and then all the others try to defend. Most opponents were trying to block on their box. We were keeping possession, trying to create space and score in a different way. I think the MLS is a bit more competitive. Now, of course, that caused an absolute minefield of comments and replies and quote tweets on Twitter and things like that. But ultimately, what Giakoumakis is saying is true there, because since St Mirren have beaten Celtic, the way that teams have been playing against them has been a low block, trying to minimize the space in the center, pushing Celtic wide and force them into crosses that were being headed or not headed away by their defenders. That wasn't successful. But St Mirren changed it a little bit here. They went for a high press. They put pressure on Celtic's midfield, and it was quite successful to an extent, James. Like it was a brave way for St Mirren to win, and somebody might look at the scoreline and say, "Oh well, they lost 5-1." But again, like I said at the start, 5-1 is a flattering scoreline for Celtic. St Mirren were in this game, and they were competitive. And if they were a little bit fitter, and if they had more power off the bench, then they may have taken something from Celtic here. So it's maybe it's not something that St Mirren can do, but maybe that's something that Aberdeen could look at, or Hibs could look at, or Hearts could look at, is, okay, if we're a little bit braver here, we have the depth. We could go toe-to-toe to an extent with these teams.
The issue, I would say, and this goes back to, opposing managers and teams and how sophisticated they are in formulating their strategy and tactics. And to his credit, Robinson seems to have, at least in this small sample size, done a reasonably good job. And I don't know how much of this was premeditated going into the game, and how much of it was luck, because he ended up facing a midfield of Turnbull, Moy, and McGregor, meaning that if I was going to, the old styles make fights analogy, if I was going to be a St Mirren manager and decide that I was going to high press and be really aggressive on the front foot in that regard, that's the midfield I'd want to face.
So, James, sorry, that was the same midfield that we lost 2-0.
Yep.
Yeah, so
exactly.
It was quite ballsy, I think, to pick it.
I agreed, and to the extent where, this is what I was saying, and to your point, and how much can you extrapolate? And Alan's points are, certainly valid on game state and timing and all that stuff. The thing that I always, because I am a world-class nitpicker in these things, is they look like the more athletic midfield for large stretches of that 70-minute period. And given the gap in resources, that is an alarming thing, right? These were not guys that are, we brought up off of the B team, or that this was a cup game in the sense that, we were just kind of playing depth guys. These guys are one injury away from, being, or two injuries away from being the midfield. So, that was the potentially alarming part, is that, because again, let's say Hatate pulls a hamstring and, we go into this cup final in a little bit of time. Rangers are going to have a more athletic midfield than St Mirren, regardless of whatever composition they go with. They'd really have to go Neanderthal to not do. They'd have to go like Arfield, Lundstrom, and I don't know, pick one other one. Jack. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, they'd have to go those three for me to be like, oh well, maybe the St Mirren one would be pretty close. But if they went with like a Tillman, Raskin, Kamara, I'd be like, that's a different ball of wax. So I don't think we're going to see this kind of mix from us very regularly, or hopefully not. And Robinson happened to have tactics that, for the most part, I think capitalized, particularly given some of the vulnerabilities we have. And we've talked about, now with Johnston as kind of the right back, and you still have the Starfelt experience and not being all that press resistant, Hart not being press resistant. So you're talking about three of the back five there that you're not getting a lot of dynamism as far as breaking the press, a high press. And when you mix that with a midfield that isn't all that dynamic either athletically, that was what it looked like to me. And again, to Robin, if you're going to allocate some credit to Robinson's credit, the way he set up certainly took advantage of that, at least for a stretch. But again, this is what I even tweeted. It was like, or I forget if it was a DM with somebody. It's like, this is going to implode on them because, they just can't keep it up. The physical demand,
running around a lot.
Yeah. It was a matter of when, not if, that it imploded on them. So that's the challenge that they have.
Well, that was one of the points that I made in the last podcast, was that to play against Celtic, or to have success against Celtic, I think you need to be able to match them physically more than anything else. Just fitness-wise, you need to be able to go toe-to-toe with Celtic. And if St Mirren were physically capable of doing that and had depth to the extent that Celtic have off the bench, then they may have got something, but they didn't. And that comes with finances, and that comes with recruitment and things like that as well. So that's where Celtic do have an advantage. And another thing that was interesting was that I remember last year when you raised some concerns about Turnbull in the midfield and his physicality and his athleticism, James, you received quite a bit of stick because Turnbull was playing very well at that point. But I think if you look at the midfield three at the weekend, who was what's the point from the midfield that you're looking at as the issue? Because Aaron Moy was playing very well up until this point. Cal McGregor has been, really consistent as always in the midfield. And when you play Hatate beside Moy and McGregor, it's quite fine. It's quite all right. Aaron Moy has loads of freedom. But when you play Turnbull and Moy, there's no pace other than Cal McGregor, and Cal McGregor's not that quick. And there's very little ability on the half turn as well to get the ball forward. So it's almost like, as you mentioned a couple of years ago under Francis Lennon, it's a toxic combination in midfield. It's three midfielders that are equally quite good, but in that three combination, it just doesn't work. It's not athletic enough.
Yeah, and again, this goes back to the styles make fights, and that is a reasonable midfield against a bunkered opponent who's not going to really be able to get out. If they're just going to absorb pressure, and we're basically going to dominate possession in the final third and just look to break down, two blocks of five effectively, then theoretically I could see, because again, Turnbull, one of the advantages he does have is that he's pretty good at shooting from distance. Which again has been something that's been on the uptick since teams have kind of been adopting this more bunkered approach, particularly since the World Cup. And so he offers that. I think that's one of his upsides. Moy's pretty good at picking apart, a defense and making some of those incisive passes, that type of thing. So again, if I was going to, make an argument as to why you would pick that midfield, I would think it would be because of facing a bunkered side. Again, to Robinson's credit, that's not how he played. And that pushed us a little bit, I think, into some of the issues that we had. And to Alan's point, they were absolutely atrocious on the ball. a team with any kind of pulse could have created some chances against us with the amount of turnovers that we had and some of the issues that we had in build up and progressing the ball through midfield. So
just to touch on that turnover point. So my new toy for this season is the packing turnover stat, which I'm finding is incredibly insightful. So now Celtic, obviously because they have so much of the ball, they tend to have more turnovers than the opposition. But on the other hand, another deeper piece I'm going to have to do is, how often does Celtic turn the ball back over as soon as they lose it? I think that's going to be quite high as well. But anyway, coming back to this game, in the first half, Turnbull had 5 of these turnovers. And when I say these turnovers, I mean he loses the ball in a situation where some Celtic players are now out of the game, and therefore, you're breaking against a sort of possibly disorganised defence, potentially. 5 is a high number, right? So and between the 3 of them, McGregor, Moyne, and Turnbull, I was going to call him Turnover Bull. Turnover Bull. That's a new nickname for Turnbull. Turnover Bull. It was 4 turnovers that they were on the positive side, and 11 against between the 3 of them. Now, McGregor, was, as I say, I think quite effectively shackled by Gogic, but I think we know with McGregor that when it really matters, he finds a way. And, maybe in a game where other people are taking some of the heavy lifting, he can kind of not coast through games. That wouldn't be fair to him. But the fact that he's not dominating the game like he often does isn't so much of an issue. And I think this was one of those games. Moy was particularly ineffective in the first half, but he found a way to be useful. And he actually got on the ball in high positions, probably more than anyone else, actually, especially in the second half. And so he definitely kind of redeemed himself in that regard. But Turnbull had a really poor game, and I see partly because of these turnovers. I see McGregor ended up with a negative packing score. Now, if I tell you that the highest packing score on Celtic's side was Alistair Johnson at 218, a negative packing score is really bad, right? That's like awful. And Turnbull's was only 19. And Moyes was 94, so Moyes was actually the kind of 4th best, and he was the best actually in terms of receiving the ball in that final third. So I think Moy found a way to be useful. I think McGregor's got plenty of credit at the bank, but the one I'd be worried about is Turnbull, because he did look slow. He looked slow of thought, and he looked slow of movement, and he was getting caught on the ball an awful lot. And when it's in concert with Moy, who although he isn't particularly athletic, is incredibly intelligent and finds a way to be useful because he's such a good experienced player. As James rightly said, I wouldn't fancy that against a Leipzig, for example. It would be horrendous. But sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, this could come down to a really intangible thing, and I'm just sort of coming up with the idea in my own head. It may not be anywhere close to the truth, but I think if you look at when Turnbull has thrived in Celtic teams, or even in his career, it's when he's the main man in midfield. And I think when you look at how far he's fallen in the pecking order at Celtic in terms of the depth chart, you'd have probably Moy ahead of him, O'Reilly, Hatate, potentially Haksabanovic if he does play him in the midfield rather than on the wing. And then you have Turnbull. Whereas about 2 years ago, Turnbull was the white knight that was saving Celtic's midfield. He was the young guy that was up and coming and going to be Celtic's main man like he was previously before he came to Celtic, before his injury. And maybe that's playing into it, that he's not the main man anymore. He's not the one that people are relying on. It's not get the ball to Turnbull and hope he can score from 25 yards out into the top corner. It's more about the team now than about one player. And some players don't tend to thrive in those team-based situations. Some players, like Bruno Fernandes, for example, at United, like some of them want to be the main man and want that responsibility and want the ball all the time. And when it's bypassing them because of a system, that can bypass them as well.
Yeah, I mean that may be an issue, like with Giakoumakis, where Giakoumakis was actually performing a very useful role, and the role that he was performing is coming on in the last 30 minutes and absolutely smashing the stats out the park against tired opposition, and that's a great role. I think if you're a 28-year-old, hitherto journeyman striker, I think that's not a bad place to be, assuming not all the things are equal in terms of wages and so forth. There's a lot of things to consider, obviously, and I think with Turnbull, I think you're right, and I think it's going to be interesting. I can't comment on his own sort of situation as regards what his sort of hopes and desires are. But at the moment, it looks like he's another one that's actually better coming off the bench against tired teams. He's actually, again, generated a lot of great stats off the back of coming on for the last 30 minutes, as what's happened on Saturday. O'Reilly, Hatate all did a nice bit of stat padding. I'm not trying to dismiss this. I think it's an incredibly important thing to have, because it turns 1-2-0 games into 4-5-0 games. And it turns tight matches into relatively straightforward matches. But you've got to be happy to play that role. Because this was one of the first times he started for a while, and it didn't go well. I'll be honest with you, it didn't go well. And I can't imagine when it comes to the next big game, or even home to Aberdeen, which is a pretty big game, that it'll be Turnbull and Moy again. I think it'll probably be either O'Reilly and Moy or Hatate and Moy, because I don't think Moy's done anything to deserve to get dropped.
Mm-hmm. So outside of the midfield, there was also the need for a couple of substitutions up front. Kyogo came off injured. He had a scan on his shoulder a couple of days ago. I think it looked like a similar injury, almost a re-hurting of the previous injury. So we'll wait and see if he is going to be fit for this weekend and maybe the final. We're not sure, but we'll wait and see on that one. But Abada came off the bench. Haksabanovic came off the bench as well in this game, as did who else was their substitute up front? Rio Hatate and Matt O'Reilly. So there's a couple of changes like in the forward line, but mainly Maeda came into the centre initially when Kyogo went off. That's where he got his goal from. But I'm interested. He got his first goal, and if Kyogo's out injured, he potentially might be the guy who comes in to replace him. But it seemed like he was coming in as a centre forward here, James. But he's played a good bit on the wing here for Celtic. So I'm wondering, is he the GG box playing centre forward that we all pegged him to be initially?
Yeah, I think that'll be, as we mentioned after his first appearance, I think it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, because his natural kind of flow seems to be more of a, more of a traditional striker. I mean, coming out wide and dropping deep a little bit, getting involved in build-up, that kind of thing. And again, he seems to be capable, at least at a functional level, of doing those things. Where again, when Maeda went into that role, he kind of played the, what we've come to know as the Ange striker role at Celtic, which is, very, very direct and relatively limited in involvement. So I don't know. It'll be interesting. If I had to guess, if Kyogo can't start, my guess is he would go with Maeda then, because again, it comes back to this issue of does Abada get a start versus O, and who's kind of more ready to go. And I think Maeda has shown that he's more than capable in that striker role in this system, particularly at this level. So my guess is he'd probably go with that iteration. But I don't think it would be an issue if it was O. We're going to be at home on the weekend, and I suspect, given what has occurred at Aberdeen this season, that they're probably not going to come out and bunker. is going to be my guess, given the complete mess that was there preceding Goodwin's departure. Again, maybe I'm wrong there, but who knows? But I think they'll come out and play a little bit more aggressively, and that should probably suit us. So regardless of who's at striker, I think we should be in pretty good shape for the weekend.
I guess this comes down to a stylistic thing here, Alan, because Celtic have no shortage of players up front. So you could play Maeda through the centre with Jota and Haksabanovic, or you could play Jota on the left with James Forrest on the right with Maeda through the middle, or you could, there's an endless number of possibilities here, especially with O as well. And do you suspect it's going to be O's place to lose since he got a goal off the bench here in this game, or do you suspect it's going to be a more traditional approach from more experienced players in the system?
Yeah, I keep coming back to, I don't think Ange's difficult to read, really. I'm not being sort of smart when I say that. I genuinely just don't think he's difficult to read. I don't think he tries to be. So, back to Giakoumakis, clearly he's burnt bridges, let's say, because, you can tell from the comments that the gaffer made. And that might explain why he's talking absolute sense. But choose your moments, don't you? And it probably wasn't the time to mouth off in that regard. But coming back to O, it looks to me like he's somebody who's going to get time to bed in. He's not going to be put under pressure, and he's certainly not going to get thrown into a cup final. Maeda is perfectly capable of playing striker the way that Maeda's playing at the moment in terms of confidence, form, responsibility that he's taking, which has just gone up enormously since the World Cup. He's not taking safe options anymore. He's taking people on. He's making more aggressive runs. He's trying to hurt teams. He's trying more risky things on the ball. I think he'd be perfectly comfortable with Maeda playing as striker, and I think that would be the way that we would go. And then probably it would be Abada on the right, because again, although Abada, I was just reflecting on Abada when before we started the show, that he's almost a player that was invented to create good stats rather than to look good on the pitch, because he just creates the most incredible stats. He really does. And even again on the weekend, he had the third sort of highest packing score, mainly because of his ability to get on the ball, and the fact that when he gets the ball, he can sometimes do pretty dumb things with it, or really sort of ineffective things with it. But he also does a lot of other stuff as well, and it's just he was almost like born to generate good numbers rather than look like a good footballer. It's really weird. So if I dare suggest, he's almost the anti-Hatate. He's almost the opposite of Hatate. He looks brilliant and does amazing things, but doesn't actually create great stats, as I've said before. So but I think I think at some point Abada's going to be given that responsibility. I think he does generate a lot of chances. He does get into great positions. I did something today, behind the two strikers. If you want the two players who create the highest expected goals per shot, then it'd be Maeda and Abada. So if you want goals, then I would play those two, and I'd play and play Jota and hope that he sort of finds his mojo a little bit, because he's been a bit subdued, isn't he? But O's not going to be thrown in my opinion. We're going to take it easy and steady with him for sure.
The extraordinary thing about this Celtic team, and maybe last season in particular, is the ability to almost forget about the players that are on the bench because of how well the starters are playing, because the amount of times that you are sitting watching and Celtic are dominating the game, and then somebody gets injured, and for 3 or 4 weeks somebody else has to fill in, say Abada, for example, when they were on that extraordinary run and he scored those goals against Rangers. Like, Abada was Celtic's main player, and then all of a sudden 4 weeks down the line you forget that Abada even plays for Celtic, because he hasn't really made an appearance bar 15 minutes off the bench because somebody else is stepping into that shoe. So there's an extraordinary level of competition for places at Celtic, and to the point of this is the second iteration of Ange's team, the third iteration maybe even stronger. So it's going to be interesting to see how the group dynamic sort of deals with that, and the Giacomacca stuff certainly ties into that. How Ange is going to deal with dressing room discontent. Is, well, you're gone. If you're not happy, you're gone. Get out, and we'll bring in someone else. So it's going to be very interesting to see how many players leave Celtic in the next 5 years and how many come in, because I guess that'll show you the way it's going to be dealt with. You mentioned the World Cup there and Maeda's form. James, you wanted to bring up Celtic's form in particular since the World Cup. And just so people know, since the World Cup, 12 games Celtic have won. They've drawn one game, that was against Rangers. They've scored 40 goals and they've conceded 7. So I would say that's pretty good form.
It is. What's interesting is that what has shifted on the margins is that chance creation, and again, this goes back to this adoption, it seems like, of more specific tactics in the majority. I think out of those 12 games, 9 were kind of in a back 5 hybrid of 5-3-2-ish, maybe 5-4-1, something like that. And then, Hibs, Rangers, and was it Morton? I think Morton didn't play that way. But outside of that, pretty much everyone else is, again, in the neighborhood of this kind of St Mirren inspired copycatism that Goodwin kind of started in saying it late last year. And since that has happened, our chance creation is down quite a bit. And again, these are all on the margin, right? So we're still talking about total domination. But for example, I get the stats bomb data for league games only, but in those 10 league games, we've kind of come back to earth in that sample. I mean, if you look back in the last 5 seasons over a comparable period of the season, kind of 10 games, which is almost a full round in the league, at least one game in a derby, going back to that 18-19 season, we're kind of back to normal. Whereas the Ange era up until this post-World Cup period had been, we've talked about it over and over, how just kind of crazy good the chance creation has been. And you also see it, though, in the opposition. They're almost creating nothing, right? So the XG conceded from open play is down to 0.3 on average in those games. That is almost nothing. So teams are, yes, they're making it on the margin harder for us. It looks like, and even like XG per shot is down back to what, we talked about, all these kind of really good central chances that we've been creating in the Ange ball era, so to speak. Again, it's 10 games. The only reason why I brought it up is because it's not like this is coming out of nowhere. There seems to be a pattern developing here. It might change, but that our kind of XG per shots back down to 0.1 on average, which we had been up in the kind of 0.12, 0.13, which again, if you benchmark kind of cross leagues and dominant teams, that's where you're getting into like the really dominant sides like Bayern Munich in the Bundesliga. That's how they dominate and create chances in that environment. So we'd kind of really pushed up into that upper echelon. And again, for this 10 game sample, we're kind of back to, or still dominant. So this introduces an interesting question, which is if teams are going to continue to play this way, you can't lose very often at all if teams aren't even really, attacking your goal and getting such low chance creation themselves. But it does introduce the risks of more kind of 0-0. I'd like to carve my eyeballs out kind of games where you have a bad day of finishing and or a keeper in the opposition that, has a really good day in shot stopping. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's an interesting thing, because it's not that we're not playing well or that our performance levels have really slid. It's more so the composition of it has shifted based off of how negative our opponents have become. And there is some effectiveness that looks like it's starting to emerge there. But it's coming at a huge cost to them, which is they're just not going to score hardly at all playing this way.
Alan, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I don't want this to turn into a stats bomb data versus my data, because stats bomb's XG model in particular is far more sophisticated than mine. What I bring to the table, I suppose, is a consistency of looking back at trends over numbers of years using the same model. So I'm deliberately not changing the model to a more sophisticated one, because then you'd lose all of the the ability to then compare it apples with apples with previous years. But what I see, and again, this is interesting. This is not criticism of James. This is probably more of an interesting insight for people who perhaps don't dig into it as deeply as we do. That there are many data vendors out there, and actually you're not always going to get the same answer, and that's quite interesting. And there's a lot of reasons for that. As a sort of professional data person, the biggest, if you're interested, maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole you don't want to go down, but a lot of it's just to do with definition. How do you define what something is? And then definition then is in the eye of the beholder. So who's capturing the data, and on what basis are they capturing it? And is it the same person capturing it? So that's, again, so at least what you get with me. I'm not saying my data is better in the sense that I use up-to-date models and high-end analytics, but what you do get is the same pair of eyes and the same brain and the same model. So at least there's a consistency of interpretation there. But with other, and again, I'm not saying that makes me better. I'm just saying that's just the way it is, right? Whereas with commercial firms, you're going to get an army of people in a data center somewhere, mass producing data, and there's now, like with FOTMob, there's a demand there to get the data out there as soon as the game, well, in fact, during the game, right? And so then they change their XG quite significantly after the game. There must be a little bit of quality control. So I often sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here. I'll shut up. But I often whenever we watch games and they just flash up something really simple like completed passes for each teams, and you'll be surprised how way out that is. Because I say that because I sit there literally counting them one by one. That's how sad I am. So anyway, all that being said, right, my observation would be that since in the period that you mentioned, Enda, sort of post-World Cup, we scored 40 goals off of 36 XG. Our average XG per shot pre-World Cup was about 0.159, and now it's 0.153. So I don't see a huge change, frankly. I think, and now my data also includes some of the cup games, so maybe there's a bit padding there in cup games, where James is only talking about league games. So again, context is important in terms of what we're covering. But and again, this isn't a bashing anyone thing. It's just different data, different context.
Mm-hmm. I guess the one of the things that we try to look at here is over a long period of time, if we are seeing a trend emerge, and I think it's marginal since the World Cup, but I'm not sure I'd be too concerned about small percentages over the grand scheme of things. If Celtic did still score 40 goals and concede 7, it's still not particularly affecting the team over a 10-game period. So I'd be surprised if it had much of an effect, bar the odd result here or there throughout an entire season.
Yeah, I mean,
you guys
as James and I are both kind of want to be nitpicky, because we don't just want this podcast to be about sitting here every week saying how wonderful Celtic are. We want to sort of highlight areas, of risk, highlight areas where perhaps performance is not optimal, and we'll continue to challenge and to do that whether people like it or not, because we just think it makes a more interesting podcast. But I'm honestly not worried by anything per se. Another interesting observation is that the number of shots that Celtic take, just the raw number of shots, doesn't change much year on year. It's actually pretty static. What has changed under Postecoglou is the quality of the shots, because, and you think about a typical Kyogo chance. It's kind of inside the 6-yard box, central to the goal, and the ball's coming in low, right? Instinctively, that's a better quality chance than a high ball flashing across the sort of the height of a 6'5" striker type of thing. So I think Celtic are continuing to create better quality chances. But as you rightly said, Enda, these things change over a long sample of data. These things change by very small amounts over a period.
You would have to drag me kicking and screaming back to the Ryan Christie shoot on sight tactics of the season prior to Neil or prior to Ange Postecoglou. It's a dark period.
Yeah, well, and again, as I mentioned, these are on the margins. So the thing that isn't on the margins, and Alan's points are important, because so one of the things that that StatsBomb has started to qualitatively adjust to their model is the velocity of shots. So they're not actually measuring, it's not like MLB baseball where they have optical cameras measuring the speed of the baseball. That's coming. Some clubs I think they're doing that in the EPL now, but universally across their leagues, they're basically, the way I've been able to ascertain it, they're kind of qualitative. Was this a hard shot? Was this a regular shot, or was this one of these little dinky shots that floated in? It was a simple save that in a traditional XG model wouldn't differentiate between that. It wouldn't differentiate between a howitzer from 20 yards and one that gets accidentally hit off the shin that floats in at like half a mile per hour, right?
Hits Maeda in the face and goes in.
Yeah, exactly. So the differences here are not small on an overall basis, meaning that the XG per game in the first 15 league games was 2.47, right? That's nuts. That's like such a high level of, and the average chance was 0.13 in their model. And again, they even model like the height of crosses. So if the ball is at your height, versus like you have to go up on your tippy toes or jump to get to the ball. That impacts the model as far as what the quality of the chance is, which again, intuitively, commonsensically makes sense. So that's down to 1.91 per game. So that's about a 20% decline. Am I alarmed by that? No. But again, this is not coming out of nowhere, because if you look at the composition of our chance creation, there's other metrics. So for example, they have a metric as far as number of clear shots. How many shots per game do you have where it's just a player with no defenders in between the shooter and the keeper? Obviously the most high probability shot that you're going to take. That's down about the same amount, about 20%. If you look at the number of shots from outside the box, which again, you're going to just by definition have more defenders, and it's going to be an easier shot to save from an opposing keeper, that's up about 20%, right? Again, these are not an abstraction. Teams are defending us in a certain way. So it would only make sense that this would start to happen. I'm simply pointing it out, that there is some statistical evidence that this is happening. It makes sense relative to tactics having sort of been shifting. And all what I'm not, this is not a negative thing. What I'm saying is teams are having to almost completely sacrifice their attacking capability in order to try and limit us this way. And we're still performing at a level that was like peak Rodgers in 1819, peak Lennon in 1920, right? That's how nuts we were domestically going into this stretch, right? So it's a nuanced analysis of what's been happening. Will teams continue to do it? I don't know. Like I've said that that's kind of how I would do it if I was some of these teams, because a 0-0 draw is a better result for them at Celtic Park than, if they can swing that on a hot day from their keeper and a bad day for Celtic shooting, than, having a go and getting absolutely annihilated, which is what's going to happen with the vast majority of the teams, how good we are under Postecoglou. So
it's fair. And but it comes, as you rightly say, it comes with a lot of trade-off. So
absolutely,
it comes with a huge trade-off in terms of the opposition effectiveness. I think that's fair.
Yeah, it might have cost Jim Goodwin his job, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, that was the trigger that kind of started the cascade of that implosion.
Well, I mean, he actually came the closest to pulling off,
making it work.
Yeah.
Yep.
But he didn't, and he got sacked.
It's not horseshoes, right? It doesn't count.
Yeah. So we'll preview this game in full next week, because it's happening next week rather than this week. But one question for you, Alan, just before we finish up: if Celtic score a goal while Rangers have a player down injured, are Celtic going to let them score a goal for free?
Did he just go into the Matrix? Are you there,
I
Alan?
think he did. Well, same to you, James, then.
You know what? I'm a big fan of sportsmanship. I thought what Bielsa did took real, you could call it crazy, but honor amongst thieves, whatever you want to call it. I think that there's a lot to be said for sportsmanship at kind of an underlying level. And context matters. I think what happened last weekend ultimately was something I like to see, independent of who's participating. But when you get into heated environments and emotions take over, who knows? I mean, a guy being down injured is not to me. It's that would not be enough. I mean, there are rules to the game. So I don't think it was that happened over the past weekend, but it sure would make life interesting if something like that were to happen. Though, talk about throwing a cluster bomb into an already boiling cauldron. That would be pretty fascinating.
Alan, I think somebody from the Rangers fan forum was hacking into our systems after I asked that question of you. So,
sorry, I lost connection there, so I didn't know what you asked, and apologies.
Well, it's sort of tongue in cheek. If Celtic score a goal and Rangers have a player down injured, are Celtic going to open up the gates and let Rangers score?
Crikey. Yeah, it's all about standards, Timmy. The the flexibility of what standards actually mean in that place is just a wonder to behold.
Michal Beale, the absolute character of sportsmanship. No, to be fair, I thought it was the right thing to do, and I thought it was absolutely hilarious to see the reaction of Rangers fans saying that he should be sacked for letting it happen.
What is the sporting integrity? I've seen it now, and I don't want to. I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, not to mention the stuff that's going on in Man City. Does that remind you of anything that's happened in the last odd years in Scottish football? But we won't open up that kind of worms tonight because we're 15 minutes into this podcast and we're just about to wrap up. So any final points before we do wrap up for one more week? Aberdeen match this weekend and then League Cup final up next.
Yeah, I just checked there. I didn't realise actually that Aberdeen have got the highest XG against of any team in the league, which is quite remarkable.
And their splits have been amazing. I mean, they have been so putrid away from Pittodrie. I mean, it's just been at an epic level. So hopefully that doesn't mean it's due for a mean reversion, but they've been really, really bad.
I mean, is there anyone in the frame? I've not seen any. I've been out all day. I don't know, but I know there was some chatter about Chris Wilder, which I thought would have been fascinating. I mean, that would be brilliant if you got Chris Wilder. I think it would just, the profile of the league would just kind of go up, and it would make Aberdeen quite a competitive team, I think. I don't know if there's any substance to that at all.
I had heard the same rumor that, and I apologize, I forget his name, but the former CEO of Motherwell, they just hired him as their new kind of head. So yeah, I mean, again, it's
so Steve Robinson then, wasn't it?
Well, they could do worse. Again, based off all these different managers, I think Robinson's been one of the better ones, but domestically anyway. But yeah, I haven't heard anything other than just rumors.
Yeah, Chris Wilder would actually be a really good appointment. We'll wait and see if that happens. But we'll get this match over and done with this weekend. And I think my connection was going a little bit there, so I think that's where we'll wrap for this week. Thanks to everyone who is commenting, and keep the comments coming in the YouTube below. If you're not subscribed, do hit the subscribe button and like the video as well. It helps people with the algorithm and helps people see the videos as well. So if you leave a comment, subscribe and like the video on YouTube. And if you want to get the podcast, it's available in Spotify, iTunes, and every other podcast network as well that you want to get it in. Just search the Huddle Breakdown and it should come up. Alan, James, thanks very much again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, we shall chat to you next week. Good luck.